Some wacky stuff in Revelation, isn't there? I'm the Denise who was on all the PowerPoint slides. If you want to know anything, join a group, want to talk about stuff, I'm the one. I'll be out there at supper. So I started a 6 weeks sermon series on Revelation last week, and we began by looking at the real world consequences of reading this book with the wrong reading strategy. So I mentioned the shooting west of Dalby late last year where 2 police were killed. I mentioned some people declining the COVID vaccine because of a belief that it's the mark of the beast. The January 6th storming of the Capitol in Washington DC is another example. I didn't mention that, and QAnon conspiracy theories have connections with a particular way of reading Revelation. David Koresh and the siege in Waco, Texas in the 90s that left 80 people dead. All those events have a connection to one particular way of reading Revelation. And it was interesting, after the service, a couple of people came up to me afterwards and talked about growing up in a family where they were always just a little bit worried that maybe their family would be raptured and they would be left behind. It's a real thing. I said last week that one of the reasons Revelation is so hard to understand is because of its genre, the type of literature that it is. We know what a poem is, don't we? Yeah. And so when we come to the Psalms, we sort of instinctively know how to read them. They're poetic. And so when we read that we can shelter under God's wings, we don't assume that God is some sort of giant chicken. That doesn't make Psalms less true, though, does it? And that image of being sheltered under God's wings, well, I think there's a lot of truth in that. But it's truth packaged in the genre of poetry, and we understand that because we know what poetry is. Truth packaged in the genre of poetry. Is Revelation true? Well, I tend to think it is. But it's packaged in a genre that we don't know how to read because we don't have this genre in the 21st century. The closest that we get to it is fantasy novels. So tonight I want to talk about what type of literature Revelation is so that we might have a better understanding of how to read it and what to expect from it. Because we're confused when we read it, but the first readers of this weird book were not confused. They were very familiar with this genre. I wonder how many of you realised that tonight's reading wasn't actually from Revelation. Did you pick that up? Maybe, maybe not. I think Jess kind of went out of her way there to give you the impression that it was. It's actually from a 1st century Jewish writing called For Ezra, probably written around the same time the Revelation was written. And now, if you've ever read Revelation, if you've sat down and read it from start to finish, you can be excused for thinking that reading tonight was from Revelation, because it's kind of the same flavour, isn't it? We've got this eagle with 12 wings and 3 heads, and it's coming up out of the sea. We've got the Most High God drawing the times to a close and declaring that the earth is going to be freed from the eagle's wicked reign. A little later in the book of 4 Ezra, the lion defeats the eagle and actually burns it alive. This sort of gruesome stuff happens in Revelation as well. It's the same kind of weird beasts and catastrophic events that we find in our biblical book of Revelation. You don't hear Christians using 4 Ezra to predict the future events of history. Not that I've heard anyway. But when we put 4 Ezra beside Revelation, we start to doubt whether Revelation is actually a uniquely magic book with a secret code that if you work out the secret code, you can predict the future. If you put it next to 4 Ezra, it starts to look like a lot of other writings that were written in the 1st century in the Jewish world. Now, that does not take away from the brilliance of this book or the relevance of its message to our time and place. It just means that we have a better idea of how to read this thing. So the vision of 4 Ezra becomes a lot easier to understand when we find out that Rome, who was in charge back in those days, liked to represent itself as an eagle. A fearsome eagle who would sweep down on its enemies and rip them to shreds. Legions of soldiers, Roman soldiers who went into battle, were accompanied by a Roman standard. It's kind of like a pole, a bit like a flagpole, right? Except that instead of a flag on the top, it's got this big metal eagle. And wherever the army went, the eagle went too. It was as if they carried the power of Rome with them. And so in 4 Ezra, Ezra has a vision of judgment being pronounced on an eagle by a lion. Now, who or what does the lion represent? Well, maybe some of you have heard of the Lion of Judah, and that's in some of our songs as well. A lion was used and still is used sometimes as a symbol for Israel. It's also a common representation of the expected Jewish Messiah. So in Ezra's vision, the lion, with the Lord Most High on its side, defeats the eagle and burns it alive. 4 Ezra makes a lot more sense now, doesn't it? Yeah. And here's some added information. In 70 CE, the Roman army destroyed Jerusalem, just totaled it, to quell a Jewish uprising there. They slaughtered tens of thousands of Jewish people, adults and children, who had all retreated to the temple in order to find safety. And the Roman legions came in and they smashed that temple to pieces. Not one stone remained on another. The Roman legions took all of the precious items out of the temple, the sacred items that were used in the religious rites of the temple, the gold and silver cups and candelabras and all sorts of things, and they carried them back to Rome in a big procession. Any Jews who survived fled Jerusalem, never to return. It was the end of an era. The day, the week that temple was destroyed, it was the end of an age for the Jewish nation and for the Jewish religion, because no longer did they have a temple to worship in. No longer was there anywhere to offer sacrifices in, which was a really central part of the Jewish faith. The Holy of Holies was trampled on by the unholy feet of the Romans and then destroyed. The dwelling place of God was laid waste. And 4 Ezra was written not too long after that. The lion gonna burn that eagle alive. Rome, the brutal eagle ripping apart its prey. The image says so much more, doesn't it, than if Ezra had simply talked about Rome. But the Lion of Judah triumphs because God is opposed to the violent reign of the eagle and sends the lion to defeat it and burn it, just like Rome burnt its enemies. You can hear the sound of hope of the Jewish nation, can't you? Even through the vengeance and the violence. You can hear the desire for the overthrow of this vicious eagle that had ripped their lives apart. You'll get yours come the revolution. That's what 4 Ezra is saying. So Revelation and 4 Ezra are both examples of something called apocalyptic literature. And I'm going to give you some common characteristics of apocalyptic literature. And if this is starting to feel a little bit like a lecture, that's because I actually do lecture on this stuff. So you're getting some of that. So, yes, there we have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, all those different colours. So firstly, apocalyptic literature is always very dualistic. The world is divided into good and evil, and there's nothing in between. And you have to pick a side. Which side are you going to pick? There's no grey in apocalyptic literature. There's no room for grey when your enemies are smashing you to pieces and your central city has been reduced to rubble. There's just good and there's evil. We see that in wartime. It gives you a heavenly perspective on an earthly situation. Apocalyptic literature says, here's the view from God's perspective. I know what it looks like down there. I know it looks like Roman legions sort of stomping through the temple, but from up here, it looks like a lion about to pounce. So things on earth look a little different from a heavenly perspective. It might look like Rome is still in charge from a human perspective, but from a heavenly viewpoint, Revelation says that God is still in charge and there are plans afoot. They're about to unfold. Apocalyptic literature usually has buried within it, or sometimes the whole thing is, either a dream or a vision. And you get this in other books as well, like Daniel, for example. Daniel has all these dreams. Ezekiel's got some apocalyptic literature, weird kind of visions of chariots and things. So in Revelation 4, John, our author of Revelation, says, "After these things I looked, and there was a door standing open in heaven." You see, he's getting an invitation to see things from a heavenly perspective. "And the first voice I heard speaking to me, like a trumpet, said, 'Come up here, so that I can show you what must happen after these things.' And immediately I was in the Spirit, and a throne was standing in heaven with someone seated on it." So John is transported via a vision to the heavenly throne room, or the heavenly situation room is another way of putting it. And he gets an inside view of God's military strategy for overthrowing the current evil empire and bringing God's kingdom to victory. Visions and dreams, well, they're altered states of consciousness, really, aren't they? And I don't know about you, but my dreams aren't always a nice linear narrative that makes sense. I'm on a horse and suddenly it turns into a boat, but I know that it's actually my house, and then it burns down, but then later it's not burned down, and then suddenly I'm flying and back to the horse. And all these things in my dream, they mean something, don't they? Like, dreams mean something. And if you reflect on your dreams, it often shows you something that you didn't realise was there. But a horse is not a horse. It's more symbolic. A horse stands for something. We've also got hyperbole, apocalyptic hyperbole. We've got stars falling out of heaven, the moon turning to blood. People are killed and their blood flows like a river up to the height of a horse's bridle. The world is ending. I could describe the pandemic that we've just been through in similar terms, I think. Do you know, in 2020, the world shrunk to the size of my house. The walls, they closed in around me. In New York, the air was filled with sirens day and night, and bodies piled up in the morgues and spilled out into the streets. In India, bodies were left where they fell, and the sound of women's wailing filled the air. The world was swimming in tears. In 2020, the world grew dark and cold, and the sun failed to shine. In 2020, the world that we knew ended. You see, I can do it too. Rather than a linear story, I think we need new batteries in this thing. Rather than a linear storyline, reading apocalyptic literature is a bit more like walking into an art gallery and just kind of looking at the different images around the room. They're all tied together somehow. There's a theme, and maybe some of them are actually moving pictures. Instead of a plot, there are these themes. The themes interact, they overlap, they intersect. The same event is told multiple times, but in different ways. In Revelation, and it would be really interesting for you to just sit down and read it from start to finish sometime in this 6 weeks. A large part of Revelation are these 3 cycles of 7. There's a description of 7 wax seals on a scroll. We heard that tonight, and nobody was found who was worthy enough to open the scroll. There are 7 wax seals on a scroll, and as each one is opened in heaven, things happen on earth. See? Heaven and earth, they're connected. And after this, after these 7 wax seals are open, there's a description of 7 trumpets that are blown, with corresponding things happening on the earth every time a trumpet's blown in heaven. And then that's followed by 7 bowls being poured out. But you see, they aren't a sequence of 21 different events, all happening one after another. It's actually more like Russian nesting dolls, because the 7 bowls are contained within the 7th trumpet. And the 7 trumpets are contained within the 7th seal. See, it's more cyclical. If there's a plot, it's more like the movie Inception. Any fans? Just wacky, isn't it? You've got to watch that thing so many times to try and keep your head from spinning. But in Inception, there are multiple plots and they happen inside of one another. And you kind of like, wait, where am I now? Am I at this level or at this level? Inception was very confusing. And so is Revelation. Which way should I point, you reckon? That way, I'll point that way. There's also a lot of images drawn from the Old Testament and from other Jewish writings as well. So some of the things that happen on the earth when the trumpets blow and the bowls are poured out are things like hail, water becoming blood, darkness, locusts, boils, fire. If you are a Bible nerd, do they ring any bells? Exodus, yeah, okay. So they sound a lot like the plagues of Egypt in the story of the Exodus. And at the very end of Revelation, we've got a paradise scene. It's got a tree of life in it. There's water, there's a river flowing through it. And it sounds a lot like Eden, the Garden of Eden in Genesis 2. I have a quote here from 2 scholars, Michael Bird, who's actually an Aussie, and N.T. Wright, who's a guy from UK. And I love the way they put this. They say, interpretation of Revelation is challenging because apocalyptic language and imagery is foreign to most people today. The book is, in any case, filled with dense allusions to biblical types and prophecies and biblical narrative. And unless the reader is familiar with them, the experience will be like watching the movie Shrek without knowing any of the nursery rhymes or fairy tales that sit behind it. So, you know, you've got Shrek that's kind of parodying all of these nursery rhymes, and in the same way you've got Revelation that sometimes actually parodies stuff from earlier. Okay, maybe this sounds all just very academic. No, let me make one more point. So the purpose of literature like this, for Ezra, Revelation, the dreams in Daniel, the purpose is to sustain people in difficult times. You see, when a people group has very little control over the events of their lives, and the ruling power wields its power in ways that make life miserable for that people group, the thing that they need most is hope. They need hope that there's more to life than what they see in the here and now. They need a perspective that takes them and lifts them above the everyday struggles that they're facing. They need an assurance that justice still exists, that suffering won't continue forever, and that God is still in control. And apocalyptic literature is a brilliant genre for giving that hope to people. So yes, maybe these are like, okay, 6 points to Denise's lecture, but, so what? What difference does this make? Well, there are actually some really important implications here. Firstly, Revelation was written firstly to followers of Jesus in the first century. That's who the book was initially written to. It wasn't written firstly to us living in Australia in the 21st century, as if Revelation's been lying completely dormant and irrelevant to everybody in the last 2,000 years, and then suddenly it's become relevant. No, it was a book written to the early Christians living in the Roman Empire, and they understood that it was about the unseen struggle between God and whatever evil forces were behind the Roman Empire. And the book of Revelation gave them hope that their current situation was not the final word. It gave them hope that justice was coming, that God had not forgotten them, that there was an unseen dimension to the world that was ultimately more real than what they could see going on around them. So far from being a book that gave coded information about something that was going to happen like 2,000 years in advance, I'm trying to think, do I care much about what happens in the year 4000? It wasn't a book that gave coded information about the future. It was a book that called for faithfulness in the present. But just because it wasn't written firstly to us doesn't mean for one moment that it's not as relevant to us as it was for them. Because this struggle is as real today as it was back then. The Roman Empire might no longer be in existence anymore, but our world is full of empire thinking and empire behaviour and empire institutions, and they're alive and well. And just like the first Christians, we too have to figure out how to live as the people of God among all the current empires of this world. And we need a revelation, because we have a hard time seeing what's really going on. We need a heavenly perspective on our earthly lives. We need to see things from above if we're to make any sense of our world. And Revelation can help us do that. Revelation is a critique of the arrogance of Rome and its emperors, who thought that the way to rule the world is to crush people, to strip them of their power so that they could never rise up against them. Revelation's a critique of false religion and false gods, gods that promise life but deliver death. Revelation's a critique of a world that worships military might, economic power, and political strategy, and uses religion to serve its own purposes. Revelation's a critique of anyone and anything that deceptively places itself on a throne and asks for our worship. It's even a critique of the church when the church uses the ways of empire to achieve its goals. So, Revelation's an encouragement for us to stand our ground, to stand with the Lion of Judah in resisting these false gods and resisting the ways of empire. Revelation is resistance literature. It helps us resist. It encourages us to make the bold political move of daring to worship and give our allegiance to the God who turns empire on its head. And so, whoops, do you want to overthrow an empire? You want to overthrow an empire with me? Because Revelation is going to show us how to do it. So, grab your lightsaber and meet me here next week.